Welcome to week 5. You made it through the informative speech, and now, without even a second to catch your breath, it's time to forge ahead and work on the persuasive speech. By now, you become an expert on your topic, so adapting the speech from informative to persuasive is not going to be as difficult as it sounds at first. Remember, the focus of your informative speech was to teach your audience about your topic, but the focus of your persuasive speech is a bit different. Instead of merely wanting your audience to gain understanding and information, the goal is for your audience to change. You can either ask them to change their attitudes, or you can ask them to change their actions. If you want them to change your attitudes, this means you either want your audience to produce a specific behavior, or you want them to just sit back and agree with you. If you're simply aiming for agreement, then chances are you want somebody else. Usually a large group of people, like some sort of government agency or regulatory body, to initiate change. Maybe you're persuading your audience that the government should raise the debt ceiling. In this case, there's nothing your audience can do but agree with you. Members of your audience don't really have the power to be agents of change in this situation. Or maybe you want to persuade your audience that the state of Wisconsin should legalize marijuana for medicinal purposes. Again, because your audience is probably not composed of legislators, there's really nothing they can do to solve the problem directly. You just want them to agree that you're right. Let's say you're persuading your audience to join the military. In this case, you want more than agreement from your audience. You want action. Or maybe you want to persuade your audience that they should donate blood. Again, you don't want them to sit back and nod their heads and agree that blood donation is important. No, you want them to go out and donate some of their own blood. As you can see, there's a very big difference between speeches that seek agreement and speeches that seek action. The first step you have to make as you adapt your informative speech to a persuasive speech, then, is to decide what kind of response you want from your audience. Now, both kinds of speeches are excellent speeches, so there's no right or wrong answer here. In all likelihood, your topic itself is going to dictate the kind of speech you give. The speech I worked on as a sample informative speech, organ donation, is a good example of a topic that dictates action. If I were to use the topic of organ donation for my persuasive speech, I would certainly try to persuade my audience to sign up and become organ donors. Just agreeing that organ donation is a good thing does not help people who are waiting on a transplant list. It's important, therefore, that I persuade my audience to actually become organ donors. Deciding what kind of audience response you're looking for is the first step in converting your speech from an informative one to a persuasive one. But next, you need to write a new specific purpose statement. The specific purpose statement needs to reflect the type of change that you seek. To persuade my audience to become organ donors wants immediate action. To persuade my audience that the state of Wisconsin needs to run organ donor awareness campaigns is just asking for agreement. I want the state of Wisconsin to act, and I just want my audience to agree. With a specific purpose statement out of the way, you will have to make sure that you have turned your attention to your method of speech design. So remember, specific purpose statements that change actions tell the audience to do something, and specific purpose statements that change attitudes tell someone else to do something. And remember, as you write a thesis statement, you're trying to summarize your speech in one main sentence. So for an organ donation speech, I would say something like, you can become an organ donor to save lives and further scientific research. Now, the method of speech design is also a very important choice that you are going to make. When it comes to choosing a method of design, your textbook can be a huge help. In your persuasive speaking chapter, you will see some methods of design that you've used before and a few that are new to the persuasive speech. Here's a table that discusses these methods. You can recognize categorical from last time. This is a great method to choose if you're going to focus on the plan or the benefits of the plan. If I wanted to spend the bulk of my organ donation speech talking about how easy it is to donate and how many people benefit from it, then I would divide my speech into categories. I would first talk about the ease of donation, and second, discuss the benefits. Comparison contrast is a great method to use if you want to show that your idea is superior to others. If you were doing a speech about joining the military, for example, you could contrast voluntary service to conscription. Sequential order works well if your plan of action needs to happen in a specific order. Maybe you want to persuade your audience to optimize their retirement money. You would lay out a specific plan of attack for them, spanning from their young working lives to the age of retirement. Problem solution is a great persuasive speech method of organization. In this method, you first establish that a problem exists, then you propose a plan to solve it. Motivated sequence is another excellent speech design. It has 5 steps: arousing attention, demonstrating need, satisfying need, picturing the results, and calling for action. Now, this kind of design works best for speeches that are looking for action from the audience. Finally, refutative design is good for topics that people oppose strongly. You have to first explain the opposing side before you can propose your own argument. And then you typically structure your speech according to the opposition's points. No matter which side of the issue you find yourself on, abortion is a topic that would work well for this design. Since the time of the ancient Greeks, persuasive speakers have been concerned with what Aristotle famously called artistic proofs: ethos, the appeal to credibility; logos, the appeal to logic; and pathos, the appeal to emotion. Let's first talk about logos. When Aristotle discussed logical appeal, he argued that speakers needed to appeal to the reasons of their audience. What is persuasion, he said, but an exchange of good reasons? Well, in order for your speech to be logically sound, you'll need to follow the principles of argumentation that I will discuss in a few minutes. On a more basic level, though, you need to handle successfully the burden of proof. When you're asking an audience to change their attitudes or their behaviors, you're asking them to upset the status quo. Status quo means the way things are. People, by nature, do not like to upset the status quo. We don't like to change our ways because we're comfortable with routine. If you want us to change, then you need to offer us some pretty good reasons for doing so. This means that the burden of proof is the speaker's to shoulder. You have to convince the audience that the way we currently do things is outdated and inefficient. Have you ever heard the phrase, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it"? Well, this expression applies to the persuasive speech. If you can't prove that the audience's way of doing something is broken, then they won't want to fix it. When Aristotle discussed ethical appeal and credibility, he came up with 2 main characteristics: intelligence and trustworthiness. The audience has to think that you know what you're talking about, and they have to think that you have their best interests at heart. Think of the last time you made a major purchase, like a house or a car. If you didn't believe that the realtor or the salesperson knew what they were talking about and cared about you as a customer, chances are you took your business elsewhere. Finally, Aristotle discussed emotional appeal. Think of a performer like Lady Gaga. She's great at appealing to all sorts of emotions: fear, happiness, hilarity, anger. What other kinds of emotions could you appeal to in your speech? And do you think that emotional appeal is ethical? And do you think it can exist without logical appeal? Aristotle imagined a world where the two work together, and I think you'll have the most success in your persuasive speech if you think of reason and emotion as 2 sides to the same coin. After discussing artistic proofs, it's necessary that we turn our attention to argumentation. When your textbook discusses argumentation, what they're really talking about are patterns of reasoning. First, they argue that you need to clearly define your central concepts. If you're talking about alcohol, should you define it as a drug? If you're talking about abortion, can a fetus be a human? If you're talking about gun violence, can you call it a public concern? As you can see, the way that we think about our key terms colors our arguments. So the first thing you need to do is define your key terms. But then you need to think about how you're reasoning throughout the speech. A very common pattern of reasoning is reasoning from principle. In this pattern, you start out with a broad principle and base your entire argument on it. In reasoning from principle, your argument is called a syllogism. Here is a classic example from our friends the ancient Greeks. Major premise, Socrates is a man. Minor premise, men are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. As you can see from this example, the minor premise pretty much goes without saying, so most of the time speakers leave it out. This is called an enthymeme. In technical terms, an enthymeme is a truncated syllogism. In our terms, an enthymeme is an argument that lets the audience supply the minor premise. This makes it a more persuasive argument than a syllogism, because it gets the audience involved in making the argument. Reasoning from reality is another method. In this case, the argument relies on the speaker's own experience or on the opinions of experts. This pattern is the opposite of reasoning from principle because it starts small with someone's personal experience and then argues toward a more general statement. For example, you could give several examples of people who eat organic produce, testing as healthier than people who eat conventionally farmed produce. Then, you could argue based on these specific instances that organic produce is better for you than conventional produce. As you can see, even though it's opposite, this pattern is strongly related to reasoning from principle because enthymemes depend on minor premises that are based in experience. We don't have to say that Socrates is a man because it's always been our experience that he is one. We don't need to prove something that's part of common knowledge. A final pattern of reasoning that your text discusses is called reasoning from parallel cases. In this pattern, you compare two things and argue that because one is beneficial, the other will be too. You could say, for example, that the U.S. should lower its drinking age because Europe has a lower drinking age. Or if you're arguing that Wisconsin should legalize marijuana, you can claim that other states with legal medicinal marijuana have been successful. So, when you're thinking about your persuasive speech, you have a lot of things to consider. First, you need to decide if you want to seek agreement or action from your audience. And then, once you've made that decision, you need to make sure that your specific purpose statement and your thesis statement reflects the kind of action you're seeking. Next, you need to decide on a pattern of organization, and you need to pick one from the persuasive speaking chapter. Then, you need to turn your attention to the arguments you'll construct in the speech. You need to think about ethos, logos, and pathos, as well as the patterns of reasoning that you'll use within the speech. So, as you can see, converting the speech from the informative speech to the persuasive speech is a time-intensive process. But now that you're the expert on your topic, it's one that you'll be able to complete with ease.